morning, everyone. We're just going to give it just a couple minutes more, just to let people kind of filter through. It's a long walk between venues, as we know. So yeah, let's just give it about 2 or 3 minutes more, and then we'll get started, yeah? Lovely. Settled, so I think we should just get ahead, yeah? Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Ha ke qala ka ho dumedisa, le ho itsebisa. Nna ke Sekwetlane Phamodi, that's my name. I work with the African Climate Foundation, where we are here to launch the new Economy Hub, which is a really exciting new venture in South Africa to do narrative development and campaign support work in South Africa to build this authentic social support for a just transition broadly, beginning with the sectoral transition around energy in South Africa, which is just the gateway rather than all the work that we have to do at home. So, in South Africa, societal understandings of the climate emergency and its relationship with energy policy and our development outcomes is quite fragile. I think for many of us who've been following the South Africa track over the course of this COP have been really hearing a lot about the various dimensions in which the narrative and the understandings are themselves quite fragile. As a result, the efforts to develop a coherent and shared discourse underpinned by why the energy transition must happen and urgently so, how it must do that, and what is practically required to make it a just and equitable one, have not really gained the kind of traction that we would have hoped. South Africa's energy security crisis, which has been at least 20 years in the making, has really heightened anxieties about economic stability and the spiraling cost of living crisis that we're currently experiencing and which we know is not unique to our country. Further to this, it's really adding ambivalence about which course the country ultimately elects to take to secure its energy future and anchor economic recovery and shared prosperity. And here I really want to signpost the transition that's been happening in Komati, a power station which has been conflated with the push to net zero in South Africa, even though we know that the power station was always going to be shut down. It wasn't working at optimum efficiency, and now there's all of this tension and anxiety in host communities of power plants in South Africa around, whether the transition will be just at all or not, and whether they will be left behind or not. And this is really what we're trying to engage with here. And so we know that broad societal buy-in and demand for the energy transition to renewables and a net zero economy is essential to achieving an energy transition that is just and which goes beyond merely replacing a carbon-powered economy for a decarbonized one, right? So it's one thing to say we're going to move across to new energy projects powered or anchored in renewables or anchored in clean technology, but it's another altogether when we use that process to power up a more inclusive economy than what we've enjoyed in South Africa for at least the last 350 to 400 years, given our history of colonialism of a special kind. So now this buy-in and demand really depends on the coherence of the ways in which climate action, socioeconomic justice, and development are really socialized, and the extent to which society is itself enabled to guide the actions of key actors and decision makers to drive the trajectory of South Africa's transition to produce just outcomes. And again here, we've had this conversation over and over. Where are workers in the conversation? Where are host communities of coal mines and coal-fired power plants in this conversation? Where are women in this conversation? Where are informal workers and the informal economy in this conversation, particularly because that is where the real economy is, but it's not particularly well enumerated or integrated into the formal economy and how we understand what makes South Africa work. Now, the New Economy Hub is really here to strengthen and amplify the voices of campaigners working to decarbonize South Africa. That's what we really want. And to build an inclusive, low-carbon economy, or even a net-zero economy that delivers social security and economic justice. It has to do work, right? It can't be a transition for its own sake. We work to build robust narrative capacity to enhance social participation and influence for how a just transition should be understood and implemented in South Africa in order to produce comprehensive and equitable distributed social dividends. And through flexible and movement generous support, which is what we offer to the ecosystem alongside our network coordination, we really hope to enable our partners to build shared narratives, movement power, and the concrete development pathways that take us to a clean, equitable energy future that underpins a new economy and just society in South Africa. Now, I'm joined with a really exciting and illustrious panel today to really talk about what it is that we're doing here, why the New Economy Hub must exist in South Africa, what the context we are working within is, and how the story actually is directly connected to and perhaps is even shaping what is happening globally. I'm joined by Salim Fakir, who's our Executive Director at the African Climate Foundation. To his left is Nicole Itano, who is the Program Director of the Green Recovery Collective, which is a program of the CCG. And then to her left is Auslebogang Ramafoko, who is the Executive Director of Oxfam South Africa. Now, before we have our conversation, I'd just like to take you through what the New Economy Hub is all about, what we do, and how we go about doing it. So, as you see, as I've already indicated in my opening remarks, we really want to see a South African economy and a South Africa altogether that has not only decarbonized its economy, but has anchored that economy and powers it through an equitable energy system that is itself anchored in renewable energy. And it's not enough that it is anchored in this renewable energy system that is also equitable, but that it must do work. It must mitigate our triple challenge in South Africa of structural and racialized inequality, unemployment, and multidimensional poverty. And this includes enhancing the delivery of public goods and services, and we'll hear a little bit about that in our conversation. How do we want to do that? Well, we really want to build, support, and amplify this authentic social demand for these concrete development pathways towards locally led and place-based development pathways that really deliver us the goods. We have three strategic priorities in this regard. The first is really about building a public information infrastructure that enables us to have shared understandings and a common conversation about what is happening with the climate emergency as it relates to South Africa, what are our responsibilities and contributions to our country, our region, and to the world. And more than that, how do we then start communicating with one another to have a coherent conversation? For many of us who come from South Africa will know we are a very very noisy democracy. For those of you who've seen the Indlulamiti scenarios that came out a couple of months ago, one of the scenarios is that we're on course to being a Hadida nation, you know, very noisy, and very laggard, but not very clear in the direction that we're going in. The second is about transition-affected communities being well prepared and sufficiently empowered to participate in both the invented spaces through which the transition arrangements are being processed, as well as in the invited spaces, my apologies, through which the transition process is being managed, but also in the invented spaces of their own creation to really lead from the base what the transition should be looking like so that we can have those locally led and place-based development solutions. And then lastly, we're looking towards having or building the capability of transition-affected communities to campaign, build that movement power, and win the outcomes that they would like to see. These are some of our partners in the last year that we've been able to bring on board. We're really excited to work with them. From the Radio Workshop, who've produced this incredible podcast that's led by one of their youth reporters based in Mpumalanga, in Emalahleni, in Creole, my apologies, to really unpack what does it feel like, what does it look like to be a coal-dependent household in a coal community. What are you excited about? And also, what are you nervous about, so that we can then really kickstart the conversation around how do we do this thing in an inclusive manner. We have the Climate Action Network, the Institute of Economic Justice and WWF consortium in South Africa who are working on the Climate Ambition to Accountability project, and they're developing a climate finance toolkit that equips and enables local campaigners to define the kinds of climate finance that they need and what that finance really should be responding to, so that we see that inclusive development right from the base going up. We're working with the Alternative Information and Development Center, who are doing really exciting research with coal community workers in Emalahleni as well as in Ermelo, both of which are host to coal mines, but also some of the biggest and most important coal-fired power plants in South Africa, in Mpumalanga. And they will be working with workers in these communities, both in the formal as well as informal economies, to map out what are their needs, what is the level of engagement to build their capability to intervene around how the coal shutdowns will be processed in South Africa. And then, of course, we work with the Conversation Africa, who are leading the charge in terms of science-based communication, because we really want the engagement to be evidence-led, scientifically based, but also very inclusive in terms of how it's pitched to people and how it builds their understanding in an incremental but directed way around how the transition will be happening. And of course, there's a whole lot of others, including the Oxpeckers Center for Investigative Environmental Journalism, who have been building this fabulous power tracker, which geomaps the coal projects that are still online in South Africa against the new energy projects, which are all coming online as well as they do that, really stacking them with the information to really build that access to information ecosystem that campaigners and decision influencers and makers all need in order to be able to drive the transition in a intentional, deliberate sort of way, but also in an urgent way. There are three key narratives that we want to drive in South Africa in terms of our strategy over the next 3 years. The first is really around green, decent jobs. South Africa, as we know, deindustrialized prematurely in the late 90s. As a result of that, we started to see the diversions in terms of increasing unemployment on one hand and then increasing inequality on the other, all of which then produces this multidimensional poverty that we're seeing. And we're saying here, based on research, engagement with workers, with communities, that one, the transition, if anything, must deliver good, decent work for people, and not just the job opportunities which last only a few months and then you're left to your own devices once again. The idea is to stack ourselves once again into a purposeful skills building strategy in South Africa so that the skills can stack on top of each other, and then we can have the jobs we need to start mitigating the structural and multidimensional poverty that we're experiencing in South Africa. The second is around ending energy poverty. The paradox in South Africa is that in spite of us being among the most electrified countries in the region, an overwhelming number of people are still living in energy poverty. I, for one, am one of those people who grew up in a household where our energy access was really dependent on 60 kilowatt hours per month in the free basic energy that the government delivers to the country. And this only really started happening around the mid-2000s when I was becoming a teenager at that point. And if anyone knows, 60 kilowatt hours a month doesn't really boil a kettle once a day for that entire month. And so what we're wanting to see is that people have direct access to cheap, clean, reliable energy right in their homes. And this can look a number of ways. It could either be through the state-based utility scale projects that are under development, but also, and we're most excited about developing the decentralized and socially owned renewable energy production models so that communities themselves can start owning a stake in the energy production market in South Africa, and to start to service their own needs as well as pump back into the grid, which we all collectively own. Then lastly, we want to see enhanced climate financing because someone must pay for this, right? We know that we're going to be accumulating a tremendous amount of debt when we are already under a great deal of fiscal pressure in South Africa. We're already seeing austerity policies being implemented in the government, which are impacting on social protections in our country. There's a big push for a universal basic income grant. We're hoping to connect that story of the universal basic income grant to the social protections we need for workers and communities who are about to be impacted by the closure of coal-fired power plants and mines, particularly in Mpumalanga, but in other parts of the country. And here we're saying really that we need the global north to come to the party. G7 countries need to give us more financing, not just for mitigation, right? We must remember that in South Africa and in Africa at large, we really are effectively on net zero already by default. So our job is not to mitigate. The work that we have to do is to build our adaptation and resilience capacity and capabilities, and that needs investment. So we're really excited to be plugging into those stories and building up the campaigns around that as well. And then, of course, really assuring that social participation in how that finance is being allocated and distributed, not only in South Africa, but through the multilateral system and through bilateral negotiations as well. And we'll hear a little bit more about that as well. And so that's really what we're about at the New Economy Hub. And I'm really looking forward to connecting with our amazing panelists today, and then we can hear a little bit from them, and then we'll have an opportunity to have a bit more of a conversation between ourselves in the room. Great, thank you. Lovely. Oh, wow, it's quite loud. Lovely. So I'm going to start with you, Auslebogang. Auslebogang, you work with an organization that has a really long history of contesting the very structure of the economy and its implications for society and particularly women. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the kinds of challenges South Africa is faced with on this front? And speaking again to women in the informal economy and how our economy is structured and what the implications they are.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on launching the New Economy Hub. I think firstly, there is a lot of information, often very abstract, often decided, designed, outside of the communities that are directly affected by climate disasters and by climate change. And these conversations mean that people who are experiencing some of these challenges are not anywhere near where decisions are made or policies are made. And if we continue on that trajectory, we are going to continue the problem that we have in South Africa, where we are one of the most unequal countries in the world. Now, I'm going to illustrate my answer to your question through a story. We recently did a short film, produced a short film at Oxfam, South Africa, of one young girl who was born the year that the power station, now I forget its name, Medupi Power Station was created. And she comes from the community of Lipalale. Now, we know the story and the amounts of money that was even put in by international funding institutions into that community. And firstly, that community does not have electricity. Secondly, they suffer from a lot of other socio-economic problems, high unemployment, high violence, high GBV. And we follow this young woman whose health has been affected by the carbon emissions from Medupi. And you see primarily women in that community going and being sent from pillar to post to try and really understand, first and foremost, how are they going to mitigate some of the risks to their health due to the carbon that is emitted from Medupi, but also how they can really restructure their community so that they've got a stake and a share in what is happening at Medupi. And what is stark about story, while the policies and everything that we are talking about are very abstract, is when you watch Rose wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning with her mother who's waking up with her, and the only source of power is the torch from one of their cell phones. And even that evening when you see her trying to do homework, she's a young woman born post-democracy in South Africa whose aspirations is to become an accountant, but at night living in an area with the biggest power station in South Africa, doing her homework using the torch of a cell phone. And through the filming of this story, a grandmother lost a grandchild who was 6 months old. Now, that for me is the power of narrative. It brings home to all of us who speak statistics, who speak figures, who speak policy, who speak a lot of this jargon, some of whom I am only learning by coming to COP, to what it means practically for people who live and are really affected by this. Now, in the report that Oxfam has just launched, 500 million small-scale farmers, the majority of them are women. They are facing catastrophic consequences due to global warming, a heating world, and they, again, for them, it is not a matter of mitigation, adaptation, resilience, whatever the jargon is. It is about today. How am I putting food on the table? Today, how am I sending my children to school? Today, how am I making sense of the world? And I think the disability movement have given us a very good adage that says nothing about us without us. And I think for us at Oxfam in South Africa, we want to see that true. Now, everything that you have spoken, which I won't repeat, also happens within the context of disinformation in the world. Everything is contested. So when you pick up this instrument and you go through it and you go into X, which was Twitter, which could be Y next year, we don't know where Elon Musk is taking the world, you are confronted with so much information. And who then basically distills it in a manner that makes sense? And we are not new in understanding the power of communication and information to help communities, individuals, and nations make up our minds. Not so long ago, we were confronted with the AIDS epidemic. For 24 years, I've spent my life at Soul City Institute. And at that institute, we understood the power of story. Firstly, this is how, mainly in Africa, people have learned very complex concepts, but also that generations have passed on their values from one generation to the other. And we saw how through the use of story and activism through Section 27, TAC, really shaped the narrative of who gets HIV, how do you get it, etc., etc. And what it did is that it gave what was a virus, a scientific issue, a face, and it basically helped us to navigate what in fact was a complex issue. And I think because we have done it as South Africa, we forget how right at the beginning, the very narrative that came from the global north was that it was a disease of black gay men, to a point where we basically said, my friend with AIDS is still my friend, you know? And we had men and women march in Khayelitsha, educating us, knowing the names of drugs, and educating us, and advocating, and finally pressuring government to provide antiretroviral drugs. And South Africa and Southern Africa has the largest rollout of antiretroviral drugs in South Africa. So we can't forget some of the lessons that we have learned, and actually think that with climate, it is going to be, it's exceptional. So my point is, you are not able to do any just transition or any transition with communities that you spoke about in Emalahleni, etc., not understanding what it means if their mines are going to close, where their jobs are going to come from, not understanding anywhere else in South Africa what it means for climate, to food and food prices, people not understanding what all of this jargon is. And I think what this gives us is an opportunity to reimagine a way in which we can create a social compact where no one group and no one person or no one entity, certainly not business nor government, hold all the answers to the problems that we face. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing. So I call Auslebogang Ausi when I should actually be calling her Mme, right? Because Auslebogang actually raised me through the Love Life campaign while she was working at the Soul City Institute. Now, the Love Life campaign is like a really powerful game-changing campaign in terms of social and behavioral change communications in South Africa, and it's certainly one of the guiding lights we look to in how we are developing the New Economy Hub. Now, I'd like to turn to you, Salim. You often speak about how climate action is essential for development in South Africa, and how development in Africa, in fact, is essential for climate action. Could you maybe talk us through this thinking a little bit?
Firstly, Sekhutlani, I want to congratulate you for pulling this together. You know how we struggle to get this going, and I do want to acknowledge that and the brilliance in which you have pulled this together. I know I'm your boss, but I want to say that. I'm not looking for a favor. But I want to stress that because it's been tough trying to think out of the box because we've been stuck with sort of the model of conventional climate campaigning, and we really needed to move the needle on a different approach. So I just want to say that we brought you outside of another field into the climate space. There's a lesson in that, and that people who come from outside can look at the picture in a very different way. So that's what you brought, and I just want to thank you for that. I also wanted to say that the just transition in developing country is not an ESG program for developed economies. It has to be something that is germane to the interests of people that are going to face transition risks in the future. And they're coming from many different fronts. Our transition risk is also being given impetus by the fact that we have a power crisis in South Africa. It ought to tell us that the old system is not working. And I just want to see whether, when we go out of the COP, where the new economy campaigns up, may want to argue that solving the energy or electricity problem is an attempt to also invest the nation or the region with a new soul, a new kind of economic soul. And I want to put that image up there because I think a lot of the conversations can get down to very boring, narrow, technical issues. It's all about power plants, the grid, this and that. But I think what the campaign should really home in on is really about recognizing the transition has a risk, but it's also about improving the position of people that cannot be improved by the old system. And the old system is actually holding us back. It doesn't matter even whether you reform and bring in new energy, new sources of decarbonized energy into the system. We have to recognize we can't plug that into the old system. I think this is what you're also alluding to. It's very easy to get caught up in plugging things into the old system, but it doesn't really invest a new soul into the current system. So we have to really try to look at that. So this is entirely not just about electricity, energy. The way I understand it in South Africa, and it might be true in Indonesia and also Senegal, it's not just about gas and renewables. It's a very bipolar debate. It's really about fundamental transformation of an old type of economic model that is not delivering the kinds of well-being that is required. So a lot of it is about jobs, and I want to say it's not just about jobs, it's about life opportunity. And what do we mean by life opportunity? People are not just driven by the wage or having a job. They also want to do other things. They want to ride a bike in a mountain. Yeah, that's the privilege of a very few people. They want to breathe fresh air. Huh?
South Africans bike.
They do. We'll show you. Lots of things they want to do, other creative things with their jobs. I see how people travel here at 6 o'clock in the morning, very tired. Is that a decent job? So we mustn't get obsessed about this is an equation of old jobs versus new jobs. It's not just about better jobs, but it's about life opportunity. And that requires a whole government approach, a whole society approach, a whole economy that has to be changed. And it's important that when we do the New Economy Campaigns Hub, we actually talk about not jobs, but what is the setting of people? What does life opportunity look for those people in a coal mining area? Is it going to be any better with lots of wind turbines and solar panels? And those are the stories we need to say. Is that it's a transition from a bad life opportunity to a better life opportunity. That's what I understand by transition. And so the electrification process of decarbonization is about transforming from the old to the new. So I want to emphasize that. Ultimately, it's about well-being, personal happiness, community happiness, and national happiness. But I want to emphasize it's not about a job, it's not about wage, it's about life opportunity. In there, you have to instill the prospect for creative capacity and self-development. So I really wanted to move away from a very sort of caricatured discussion that's happening here to opening, because the New Economy Campaigns Hub gives us an opportunity to really rethink how we transition from an old system to a new system and how decarbonization can support that. I want to say a second thing. We are in discussions, I can't say too many details, about setting up a new economies center actually in DRC for this very reason, because a lot of the discussions, and I don't want to criticize international development agencies and NGOs, everything time they think about DRC, it's all about the forest. Actually, the whole DRC needs more than just the forest to protect the forest. Yeah, so you have to sort out other economic challenges in order to save the forest. And I think this is true about climate debate as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Salim. So I want to turn to you, Nicole. So you and I have spent many, many days having this conversation around, well, you know, if our value proposition is about this new economy that that triggers or creates the conditions for, you know, these new, better life opportunities, and that requires us to, you know, rethink the economy in South Africa and how it's structured. We then also really have to be thinking a great deal about what South Africa's new economy is plugging into, right, in terms of the rest of the world. So at the GRC, you do a lot of work in terms of kind of connecting communities of practice and campaigners between the Global South and the Global North to kind of really reimagine what new economies might look like. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how the New Economy Hub fits in?
Thanks, Sekwalani. So first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here and to see the sort of fruits of really many, many months of thinking and research and analysis coming to fruit here. And you know, for me, in many ways, this is a return to sort of my early career. I had the enormous privilege of sort of forging a lot of my thinking about this as a young journalist in South Africa, covering the AIDS fight. And you know, I was so thrilled to hear you talk about that and the lessons that we could learn from that fight, because I think there are so many lessons that we can draw from really what was one of the most successful campaigns, uniting Global North, uniting Global South, but you know, with a heart in South Africa of the people who were most affected demanding their rights. And I think at its heart, one of the reasons that campaign was so powerful was not just because it articulated the problem and educated people about the problem, but also because it posited a solution. And I think this is one of the things that we, particularly in the climate world, don't do a very good job of. We're very good at talking about all of the terrible things that are going to happen if we don't solve climate change, and we're very bad at giving people hope for any alternative. And we're very good as campaigners and communicators at stopping power plants and stopping oil production. We need to keep that fight up. It's hugely important. But we're also very bad about, you know, as Sekwalani has outlined, explaining to people and getting them excited about what's going to take its place. And the problem is, particularly in a Global South context, if we do the first bit without doing the second bit, that is weaponized against us. And it is turned into a narrative of these people from the Global North who want to come and tell us that we can't have the things that they have. You know, we can't have electricity and we can't have jobs. And, you know, I come from global philanthropy. We are complicit in this. The money, the very little money that has gone to Africa for storytelling and communications and campaigning on climate change has almost exclusively gone to campaigns and communications about stopping oil and gas and coal. And I think the sort of origin of this work with South Africa and with some of our partners in Brazil and Indonesia has been thinking about how do we shift that narrative, how do we build that sense of hope, that sense of opportunity, that alternate pathway. And it really is about storytelling. How do we create those stories? And I think to your question about how this connects to global, local, and national, the other sort of side of the work that I'm doing is around the global finance system and how do we reform that system to enable finance to flow at the scale, speed, and quality we need it to flow to the countries that need it most. And one of the challenges about that conversation, it is so technical. It's about SDRs and, you know, reform of the multilateral development banks and capital adequacy frameworks, things that are, you know, so technical that most people's eyes glaze over. And we have to find ways of connecting that back to the real things that are happening in real communities. And so for me, the work that South Africa is doing and that the new economies Hub and ACF is doing is so critical because it is one of those pivot points in the global conversation around how we deliver a just transition. And so there's an opportunity there to take that story and make it an example of how we deliver that change, and how we deliver that change not just in ways that benefit climate, but in ways that actually create a better world, and a world where we want to live, that provides for the basic needs. But to that point about South Africa and the AIDS crisis, I'm sure you've seen it everywhere. There's lots of windmills and solar panels here. And if you're sitting in a village in South Africa and you see a solar panel or a picture of a solar panel or a windmill, without that storytelling around it, you're thinking, I need to feed my children. How does that solar panel help me do that? So in the work we've done with working to develop this project with ACF and with partners in Brazil and Indonesia, those projects look very different because the infrastructure is very different, the stories that need to be told are very different, but there's a few sort of commonalities that I want to pull out that we've seen in all of these places. So the first is, we need to do a better job of understanding where people are so that we can meet them where they are, and that requires good research into public opinion and to find the places where we can connect climate change to real world bread and butter issues that people are living. And those are different in every place. But so we need to do some of the polling and focus group testings to understand where people are and where those connection points are. The second thing is that one thing that has dramatically changed from the AIDS fight is the communications landscape is utterly different. And the way people consume these stories has fundamentally changed. And so we need to upskill our campaigners and communicators with these new technologies to be able to help them understand not only how do they frame those messages in the right way, but how do they distribute them and actually get them into people's lives. It used to be traditional TV. TV's a dying medium, and I say this as someone who worked for many years in TV. It's storytelling on digital. It's still radio is incredibly powerful. It's WhatsApp and sort of person-to-person communication. So how do we do better about using those communication tools and training our campaigners and communicators to be able to use those effectively? The third is, this is such a complicated issue. There's so many facets of it. How do we find those specific stories that can be stand-ins for the larger issue and bring it down to things that are actually understandable but also local? Because one of the things that a lot of the research around communications and climate change has taught us is that kind of broad statements about the green transition is going to give you jobs don't really resonate because people want to know how they're going to give them jobs in their communities. Now, we don't have the resources to be able to do that in every community, but what we can do is we can find the communities that are pivot points for the conversation. And those are countries and within countries specific localities where the transition in those specific places are driving the conversation on a national and international level. And then if you can intervene and shape the conversation at those pivot points, that can help tell a broader story on multiple different levels. But in order to effectively engage in those pivot locations and pivot points, we need to have the research and the evidence that shows us what actually are the alternatives, and then connect that to the storytellers and the campaigners. And what I'm really, really excited about what Sekwetlane and the African Climate Hub are doing with the new Campaigns Hub is providing and beginning to build some of that infrastructure to make some of those connections, to understand the communication landscape, to train communicators to be able to tell those stories, to find the pivot points and connect the research about what those transitions might look like to those campaigners and communicators. And that's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take years. And one of the lessons for us as philanthropy is we've got to have some patience. We can't expect outcomes in 6 months or 9 months or a year, which often our grants, is the lifetime of our grants. We need to do the patient work of power building, of movement building, and be prepared to shape that conversation, not just in that slow incremental way, but also when those moments of opportunity come, be ready to seize those and shape those.
This is music to my ears, especially when it's coming from someone who works in philanthropy, right? That it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes, purposeful work. And so we do need that runway and that latitude to be able to build that power base and to build the narratives and the stories that we need in order to win power, because no one's going to give it to us just so and so. On the research and evidence bit, I'm very happy to say that we've just concluded the first of its kind narrative research on climate narratives in South Africa, where we've looked at broadcast, print and digital media, as well as social media through a listening exercise, and then went into communities to do some audience engagement work and polling over 3 years. So from 2020, just when the JET-P was launched, up until September of 2023, and we'll be presenting that research early next year, and I'm very excited to kind of just share a little bit of those insights. I think there are two key things that come up from that research for us. The first is that for those people who don't know anything about climate change, and that's a big proportion of people in our society, they immediately are able to make the connections. They want to know more. And more than that, they also already feel that this is a priority and should be prioritized by government, because people can now connect what is happening in terms of the climate itself and their livelihoods themselves. That's the first thing. The second thing that we're also noticing is that the share of voice in South Africa is dominated by the public sector, and not because the public sector is doing anything. It is about 40% share of voice. It's not because it's doing anything deliberate here. It's purely by default, because things have to move through the state. Another 40% is dominated by the private sector, particularly mines and banks, right, who are driving their ESG strategies and communicating those. And that's where the deliberate communication work is happening. And then for the rest of it, it's incidental coverage that is happening, largely because our media system itself is starting to have the bottom fall out from under it, right? Media concentration has produced a financialization and then a juniorization of journalism. And so part of the key work that we're doing, and this is why we're very excited to have the likes of the Conversation Africa as one of our partners, is that we are then able to just really close that loop in a very direct way, because they function as a kind of editor of editors, if you will, where what they publish, which is science-based, produced by researchers, both in terms of papers-driven or research-driven coverage, as well as news coverage, we're then able to get science-based narratives into the story, and these are very rapidly carried by other publishers. But of course, we definitely need more than that. We really do need to be working on the support and development of journalists to be able to tell the wide range of climate stories, everything from arts and culture through to business and the economy, into energy and the environment, so that we can really start connecting the dots that climate is the story of our lives, of our generation. It is the air that we breathe. Now, we've only got 10 minutes left between us, so I'd really like to open it up to the room, maybe for just one round of about 3 questions or so, and then we can bring it back to wrap up. Any questions? Yeah, please.
Hello. Okay. Hi, my name is Iran. I'm a youth delegate from the Singapore Pavilion. Yeah. I wanted to ask. Just now, you mentioned that South Africa is essentially net zero, and so it doesn't have the responsibility to mitigate climate change. Can I ask more about that, and also for the global? Sorry, for the global. Sorry. for the global north to support countries like South Africa in their transition, what do you think is needed to actually convince these countries to do more for South Africa? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah. So Africa is net zero by default, right? Of all global emissions in the world, Africa is responsible for how many percent? About 3 or 4%, 4%, right, of those emissions. A great deal of those emissions come from South Africa and then several North African countries, Egypt, Morocco, and Nigeria among them, right? So that's already giving you a perspective of, what are the power imbalances and what is the balance of responsibility between South Africa and Africa generally in relation to the world, and particularly North America and China, who combined make up about 40% of the world's emissions, right? Many of which are actually driven back to North America and Europe once again because of consumption. So, what is the responsibility there? One, we do definitely need to see a greater commitment from particularly G7 countries in providing greater levels of finance at a far more concessional rate with a greater proportion of grants than what we are seeing. The analogy that we've been hearing in this room over the last week that I've been here is that what's actually happening here is something like my child is playing in my yard, they kick a ball, and then that ball then goes and breaks the neighbor's window. And in breaking the neighbor's window, I go over to my neighbor and I say, neighbor, how about I give you a loan to repair your window, right? I think it bears itself out, right? The analogy bears itself out in terms of what the responsibility of of G7 countries is to Africa and South Africa in particular. I think that the other thing here is that South Africa was the first country to embark on a JET-P process, and then was also the first country to successfully negotiate an investment package from the IPG. So there's a great deal riding on South Africa's success in being able to manage the transition in a way that demonstrates to the world that not only can this be done, but it can be done ambitiously with deep and structural impact for our society and our economy. And to that extent, what we are really needing to see more of from the Global North is a great deal more flexibility in terms of the kinds of supports it offers our country, and also the scope of projects that we are able to invest in, right? Not just coal shutdowns, but also project development, right? In terms of also social development and protections, so that we have those mechanisms in place. Once again, we are agitating in South Africa for a universal basic income grant. It's not simply about providing free money to people so that they can have that free money. It's a lifeline, but more than a lifeline, it also creates a basis for people who are about to lose their jobs and their livelihoods through the shutdown and closure of fossil fuel projects in South Africa to then be able to contest and campaign for much more than a meager 350 Rand per month. That's about what, 25 pounds? So let's really think about it, yeah? So I think these are the kinds of things that we should be agitating for. Are there any further questions before we wrap up? Thanks, Nkateko.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the submissions from the room. I am Gatego, Programs Director at Oxfam South Africa. Question perhaps for you, Sekwetlan, is how are you thinking about, one, almost decolonizing the northern language that we see with how climate is really communicated and very much inaccessible for communities? And if we're talking about narrative framing and understanding how this plays out at a social level, what are some of the tactics that you could share? On a second point is also perhaps asking around how you also perceiving the new economy hub's role in breaking down the barriers to participation. We are in a country that has heralded a unique process with the establishment of the PCC, which is also part of social compacting. It came out earlier on. But how do we unlock those barriers to participation in a practical sense? We speak community mobilization, but we're not really organizing at that level. So what potential role could the New Economy Hub play in that sense?
Great. Decolonize or decolonialize. Yeah? Giving. Both end. Right. I think the first thing here is that we have to own this process, right? Some years ago, I had the great fortune and privilege of meeting a woman called Bompateleni Makauleli, right? She's a leader among the Bavenda people. She is an environmental steward. She is a traditional healer. She's an indigenous knowledge custodian and transmitter, right? Running an organization called Zomola Mopo, the voice of the natural world. And something that I was reminded of in my interactions with her was that amongst us Africans, right, the relationship with the natural world and building an equitable balance as we take from the world, we give back, right? And we care for, because we have to go back to that place, is that within our very cosmology, our worldview, our religious and spiritual practices, there is this deep and embedded consciousness that we are nothing without Mopo, the natural world, right? That which we've been bequeathed by the Maker. And in so doing that, all of the work and how we build and generate economies, and particularly doing, impacting on others, on the environment we collectively share, and the non-human species that we also have to interact with. And this is about consciousness of things like biodiversity, extraction, but with limits. A consciousness that we need to have intergenerational justice, because we will leave here, our children and their children beyond them will still be here, but we will remain ancestors to them, and we want to be good ancestors. Right? Where we are looked to as the people who destroyed us and the opportunities for young people, but really are the ones who made and created new opportunities, life opportunities for generations to come. So that's the question of decolonization of these ideas. And I think it ties quite neatly into the question of then how do we connect the dots? How do we bring and prepare communities into these stories a little bit more directly? I think the critical thing here, and this is something that we're quite excited about doing, is really about reminding people that they have the knowledge and they have the power in their own hands, right? So we don't have to do more than what people are already doing. Our job is to amplify, our job is to support, and then follow where people lead, right? Based on this idea of locally led, place-based development ideation. And to this extent, it also means that we want to build research capacity within communities. So all too often we find that these outsiders, these they come in with their big degrees, they come and then they investigate us, they research us, and then they leave us, and then they make names for themselves. What we're saying here is that actually, people have the knowledge in their hands, right? What is for us to do is to equip them to build that knowledge for themselves so that they're able to wield it and present it in these spaces, and to open pathways for them to then be able to enter into these rooms of power and to shape what is happening in those dialogues and discussions, both on an invented basis, where they are brought into our public participation process, which all too often looks like a register ticking exercise and is being rejected as such more and more by community people and activists, but also through invented spaces where people open their own fora in which the people who have power have to come in and negotiate on the terms of those community people around what should happen here. And I think, with the work that's been happening with the PCC, the PMU, around, how do we really concretize these new energy projects? How do we concretize these transition projects in the lived experiences of people? There already really are seeing that light and are saying we need to give to people the means and the opportunities for them to define what is the project that is going to generate the jobs, that is going to rehabilitate the destroyed environment, that is going to build these economic value chains, both in the formal right down into the informal economy, so that we can really build robust and resilient local economies, because that's really where it's at. So these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to do. It's now 11, and we're having to wrap up. I'm going to ask each of you as we close off, right, just one thing, if anything, that the New Economy Hub should be doing in South Africa. Just one thing. Thank you.
So for me, representation matter. And it's until we are deliberate about telling the stories that are not mainstream, stories of the women that you are talking about, stories in languages that we often don't hear in this discourse, that we are able to show that a new alternative is possible.
I would say making those alternatives famous. Yeah, taking those stories of alternatives, making them real and amplifying them into the world, but grounding them in what people and communities want for themselves, but helping use that to drive the broader story for South Africa and for the world.
Just keep doing what you're doing. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Well, there you have it. Lebogang Ramafoko from Oxfam South Africa, Nicole Etano from the GRC and CCG, and Salim Fakir from the ACF, the African Climate Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please take a pamphlet with you, and please be sure to scan yourself into our website and see a little bit more about what we're doing in South Africa. Thank you.